In this episode, we'll discuss how to speed up your marketing approval process with these must-know concept review tips. We'll talk to Heather McFalls, Director of Advertising and Promotional Review at Organon. We will discuss the following questions. How often do people do concept reviews? Is it useful to have an attorney at the concept review stage? Is the role of PRC advisory or quality focused? Who owns the PRC process? Should the PRC process be sequential or parallel? Has AI been disruptive to the concept review process? Stay tuned, let's get into it.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of DarshanTalks. I'm here with Heather. I'm gonna have Heather introduce herself, but I'm hoping to talk a little bit about promotional review and specifically concept review. But before we get started, Heather, tell us about yourself.
Hi, I'm Heather McFalls. I'm a director of ad promo at Organon, and I've been doing ad promo review for about 10 years and been in the industry for about 15.
Thank you, Heather. So you are the perfect person to have this conversation with. So let me ask you a really basic question. You've been in the industry for 15 years, doing ad promo for 10. In your experience, how often are people even doing concept reviews? Because when I do it with people, the smaller companies almost never get into concept review. It's the exception more than the rule. But what is your experience?
Yeah, so I've been at big and small companies, or I guess small to mid-size. And you're right, at the smaller companies, when I started, we didn't really do concept reviews at all. Sometimes at the bigger companies, it's a little more well-established. But even so, I think that the whole process of a concept review is understated at most companies. I think that a lot of people think that it's kind of a quick touch point, be like, hey, I have an idea, this is my concept. And then they go off, develop the entire thing, and then bring it in for full review. Whereas concept really should be a series of reviews, a series of conversations, and a lot of your work for the asset should be done up front and in combination and teamwork. So I think it's definitely a development process to bring it into a small to mid-sized company and even to further develop it at a large size.
I love that you say that it should be, for lack of a better term, iterative. And the reality is it's not. My question for you is a simple one. What tools have you found to be useful, if any, for concept review? Or do they tend to be better off in the actual review process?
So I actually think it's a combination of two things. One, you do need something written at some point to react to. It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be, formal or super laid out. But, I kind of think of it in a three-step process to boil it down. So somebody calls you, says, hey, I have an idea. Great. Give me something to react to. So you have another conversation. And this time they thought it out a little bit more, might have a timeline, simple PowerPoint, simple Word document, nothing formal. By the time we get to full concept review, and it should be an in-depth deck, I definitely find Viva to be a very helpful tool. I like having something to pre-review, something that I can put some comments in, something that I can react to. But I also think that it's not just more communication, right? It's the right kind of communication and really understanding what the other person needs. And I think that's where it is. It's about the growth of the communication and understanding what information do I need in order to give you what you need if you're a marketing person, right? And what does a marketing person need from me? And so how do we extract that information from each other or other third parties as necessary? So I think it's a combination of the two.
I love that. So let me ask you this. So in these scenarios, when you're in that initial stage, do you find it useful to have an attorney? And I'll ask you, to be fair, I'm an attorney, so I may be slightly biased here. However, the fact is that you get attorney-client privilege. Do you find that to be useful, or is that unnecessary at this point because you're not actually reacting to a piece, you're reacting to a concept?
It really depends on what the concept is. For something that is kind of an established norm in the industry, like, hey, I want to do another type of video, right? You might not necessarily need an attorney at that point in the conversation because there's nothing really new about the overall concept, maybe just about what's going on within it. Whereas if you want to try a new event or you want to try a new type of asset your company hasn't done yet, then I think an attorney is very helpful to have, particularly if you have things about payer communication or any type of privacy that might be needed. So I do think that it's dependent on the asset.
One of the things I love about concept review is that collaborativeness. And I love the idea of coming together and saying, let's solve a problem. The question becomes, and I've had this discussion actually at the conference we both attended recently, what is the role of PRC as you see it? And the two options we had that I threw out were, do you see the role as PRC to be advisory in that here are the risks, here are the benefits, you guys decide what's appropriate? Or do you see the role as quality, where you're going, if it doesn't pass the quality check, it doesn't move forward? I've had marketing tell me one or the other, depending on who you talk to. What is your takeaway and why?
I think it's a combination of the two, which we talked about at the conference. I know you don't like that answer, but I really do think that, we work in a regulated industry, so there are boundaries, and I think that they're important, right? I think that each company decides where on that boundary they want to sit. And so it's going to dictate where your regulatory department sits as well. Are they more qualitative or are they more advisory? I tend to see it more as qualitative, but I also see that as a teamwork effort, right? Because it doesn't have to be so black and white. It doesn't have to be yes or no. It can be, okay, what's your primary objective? What are you trying to do? And how can we find a compliant way to do it? Maybe I can't do your first choice, but like B or C, can we work together to find you B or C?
I love that. So what you do is you, for lack of a better term, set up a base, a minimum floor that must be met. Beyond that, we can have conversations to achieve a eventual goal. And beyond that, you might say, you know what, the risk is higher here, but I will sign off on it as long as you understand the risk. Is that a fair?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I think a lot of times when the business wants to try something different, that they might end up taking on that risk. They understand that the risk that they're taking. And I think that it's our job to fully inform them of those risks and try to stay below that risk threshold. But sometimes ultimately the business does make that decision.
Now, do you ever worry as part of the concept review process that as you work collaboratively, you lose objectivity? Because now you are part of the process that brought that promotional piece forward. How do you address that loss of objectivity as a result of your participation?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing is just keeping your emotion out of it. Doesn't mean that you necessarily can keep 100% objectivity, especially because you start to invest time and money and effort in this. You also want to see it come to fruition. But I think my job as a regulatory professional is to keep a certain level of distance, right, on an emotional level, and to be able to consistently try to view it as a third party might view it, or a regulatory authority might view it. And so taking a step back every time you kind of talk about the asset is important. I also think that asking another internal party, like as somebody else in your department, to say, hey, take a quick look at this, tell me what you think, and bouncing ideas off each other is critical in this type of a role. To help you kind of reset that boundary of objectivity.
Now, do you so you don't formally do something like, if I help you in concept review, I won't review your final piece. In fact, you would try to be the person to review the final piece because you helped in the concept review. Do you see value in that, or do you sort of go, the point is the collaborative review? If we change the rules at the last minute, we are defeating the purpose.
Yeah, I think it's really important to try to keep the same team on something from conception to execution, because there is subjectivity, right, in what we do. And so if you bring in somebody new halfway through the process, midpoint through the process, they might have different sensitivities, they might have different experiences, they might have different things that they react to, and it can really kind of throw the whole process into turmoil or churn, which is what you're ultimately trying to avoid with concept reviews, right? I mean, sometimes it's unavoidable and you still want to get like a touch point, but I think it's important to have a consistent message the whole way through development.
So let's talk about that development process. Let's talk through the process of setting up a team that's going to help with promotional review. Do you actually set it up so that it is a segregated, necessary part of the promotional review process, or do you let the system fail a few times, and then let people go, we really should be addressing this up front. This should not be coming to all the way to promotional review, but to get rejected.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what happens at small to mid-size. They don't do the concept, they don't do the development. They get to review, and suddenly there's a big problem, or a big holdup in timing, or they can't move forward with that asset. I don't advise being in that situation. If you can avoid it, it's not a pleasant conversation, but it happens, right? And so I think you're trying to avoid that. And so you do essentially have to let the system fail a few times. Unless, you get partners that really want to jump in and say, hey, how can we avoid this in the future? And really dive in from the beginning to kind of set it up. Maybe you only have to fail once. And I also think it's important to understand and acknowledge that failure is an important part of the concept process. And the reason you have an iterative process is so there are earlier points of failure. So there's not, a giant loss of time, money, and effort. Maybe it's only like half, or maybe it's only a quarter of that. So I do think that part of the importance of it is an earlier failure point.
Do you think concept review is a more efficient process, or is it a less efficient process for the greater good because you're building more quality into the system?
It is 100% more efficient from end to end. I know that it doesn't feel more efficient while you're going through it because you're doing so much work up front. But from a timing perspective, from end to end, from concept to execution, it is faster because you are doing a lot of the high level work, the background work, the escalation talks, the contract talks, whatever you need earlier on in the process. And so by the time you get to your asset review, 1 to 2 reviews is usually all you need. At most, as opposed to if something comes in fully developed, at that point you might have 6, 7, 8 reviews because now you have to have conversations. You have to go back and see what needs to be done. Your timeline has changed. Contracts need to be like rejiggered, whatever it is. And so it actually ends up causing a lot more churn and pain and relationship damage if you at the end, but also time. And it's not just like getting it into the system because it ends up doing more cycles of review. Whereas if you do that work up front, by the time you get to the review, it's much faster.
Who owns the process? Is it regulatory? Is it medical? Is it marketing? Who do you think owns the process?
Yeah, I think that's really dependent on the company. Sometimes the PRC process sits within regulatory, sometimes it sits within compliance, sometimes it sits within commercial. So I think that's really dependent on the company. But I think that what's important is the mindset, and that all inputs into the system, all inputs into the process take ownership of their piece of it and take ownership of bringing something to the table at every piece of this review. So regardless of who owns the process at the end of the day, I think you all have responsibility for it.
So let's assume everyone takes responsibility for their component. Talk to me a little bit about the change in flavor as a result of, say, regulatory owning the process versus marketing versus clinical versus someone else versus legal. Legal never owns this, let's be honest. So it's the other three usually. It's rare. I've seen it happen, but it's rare.
I think it depends on how it's set up. I think under regulatory, it tends to be a little bit more strict, process oriented. And I think there's slightly less flexibility, which isn't a bad thing if you're regulatory. I think under commercial, it can be a little bit more flexible and a little bit more driven by pure timelines. And I think sometimes other parts of the system can suffer because of that. So I think there's pluses and minuses to being in both sides of the system.
I find it fascinating. You spoke about regulatory, you spoke about commercial, not clinical. Why do you see that as a less routine version of events, if you will?
Yeah, for promotional review, I wouldn't anticipate that clinical would own that process. Clinical, for me, inputs into it. If you have, new clinical study, if you have new clinical trial, especially new trial data, they're often an SME into the system, and they can provide a lot of really valuable insight, but they wouldn't own the process.
So usually we talk about your promotional pieces. If it is a non-promotional piece, how do you how does your flavoring change? First of all, do you as regulatory tend to get involved in non-promotional review? And if you do, talk to me about the concept review there and how is it a different flavor?
Sure. So I've often been involved with medical education, medical type reviews, and your role does change. You're still looking for truthful, accurate, non-misleading. Of course, you're also making sure there's no promotional tone to the pieces, right? I think the concept review process, though, is really the same. And I do think it's a little bit less driven by commercial instincts, obviously, if you're on a medical side. But I do think that there are different SMEs that need to input. Maybe it's outcomes research, maybe it's medical affairs, maybe it's clinical. And I think that you're just working with a new group of people. So really kind of having them understand what you need in that process and how it needs to be supported in that process might require a little bit more education, simply because they're usually more on the development or research side of the company and not as familiar with the face-to-face to a customer or to an HCP or to a payer audience side.
I love that because I actually landed up writing an article recently on just First Amendment right principles associated with medical communications. And it's a fascinating area because there's so little guidance on the idea.
Right.
Something as simple as, does the FDA even have jurisdiction over medical communications is controversial, shall we say, which I think regulatory would go, it's not that controversial. The FDA has jurisdiction. But I think from a legal perspective, the government has very little control. So that's a different beast altogether. So I love that you have an opinion. I love having these conversations with smart people because you learn so much about this stuff. So in those scenarios, you're talking about really having an input. Do you, whether you're talking about medical education or we're talking about promotional pieces, could you talk a little bit about systems you've set up before that have worked around creating a pre-review process?
Yeah. So we have standard review times in our process for different types of pieces. It's going to depend on the company for what those timings are. But I think it's really important to have them. You need time to digest, you need time to ask some questions and do your own research, right? Our job isn't to just kind of look at what's on the page and react to it, but what are the other things that could impact this? And so I think you need to take it in groups. If you have a really content heavy piece, like a medical really heavy piece, you want more time to pre-review this, right? Look at the asset, look at the audience, look at the references. Is it supporting? And then, if it's new data, go talk to your medical people, go talk to your clinical people. So I think it's part of your job as a regulatory person to understand who you need to go talk to or find out who you need to go talk to in order to do your best review on that piece. For something that might be, a banner ad, you might need less review time, but that doesn't mean that review time is any less important. You just might not need as much of it because there's not as much in depth. So I think you can be a little bit flexible depending on your overall workload and who else needs to input. Like my workload might be lighter, but maybe my attorney or, my medical counterpart has a real heavy workload. So we need more time simply because of that. So I think it's teamwork, and I know we're going to go back to communication, but it's all about that communication.
When you set it up, do you set it up to be sequential or do you set it up to be parallel where all three of you are working at the same time versus they don't get it until you have finished reviewing or vice versa?
I've been in both situations. As a reviewer, I prefer concurrent. I think that it allows for better communication amongst the review team, and it doesn't keep you kind of out on an island, because that's not really our job. Our job is really to work together. And so if you're kind of out on an island, like, oh, I guess I'm doing this by myself now, somebody just can't even look at it until you're done. I think that has a lot of flaws in the process. So I do prefer concurrent.
But I would argue that marketing a commercial would take the position that you then land up swimming in someone else's lane if it's concurrent versus if you're sort of set up sequentially, the argument would be you stay in your lane, you answer the questions you have to answer, and then you move forward. Do you find one to be more efficient than the other, or do you find that that's defeating the purpose, like you said, of us being collaborative?
I think concurrent is actually more efficient, because a lot of times I'll have, if I have a question and I know that a fellow reviewer we'll talk offline before the meeting, and sometimes we don't need to put the comment in, or sometimes we like figure out what we want to say or how we want to adjust it prior to, a live review of an asset. And so we can kind of have little conversations along the way. Whereas if it's sequential, I can't even start mine until they're completed and they've moved on, right? They've moved on to something else. And now they have 4 sets of comments or 3 sets of comments, however many people are reviewing for you in order to deal with. And then you still have to have that conversation to figure out any questions or comments anyway. So you might as well just do it at the same time.
In the pre-review process, what is your opinion about putting comments in? And what I mean by that is all comments you put in are discoverable. Do you as a reviewer either go, I will not put the comments in, I'll discuss them. And the logic would be that by doing that, I am voicing my opinions, but I don't have to have someone sort of Monday morning quarterbacking me. Alternatively, I want my comments on the record, because if I put my comments on the record, if someone goes the other way, I put my comments out there, I can sort of stand by them.
Yeah. So I think that is down to the policy of the company that you're with. Some do want full comments in the system for precisely those reasons. Others would prefer not to have them on the record. I tend to like putting easily resolvable comments in the system, or simple, straightforward, but sometimes context matters and that discussion matters. So if it's slightly more complex, I prefer a conversation, simply because words can be misconstrued. And if I'm asking to make a judgment call on something, I can't necessarily write out my judgment in writing. So for me, it's more about efficiency and being able to have that conversation so we can make sure both parties are on the same page.
When you review, do you look at what you approved in the past? Or is it just sort of interesting to know, but you're always going back to what the guidance actually says? What actually determines whether you'll say yay or nay?
So it depends. A regulatory person's favorite phrase, it depends. I think that you always start with the regulations, the guidance, right? You always go back to what you know. I think that other things like previous advisory comment submissions, current OPDP letters that have come out might change how you're looking at something, how you're thinking about something. New data can change how you're looking at something. And also things like social media apps, they update all the time. And so if you're ever looking at an asset, chances are that social media platform has changed. So can you even consider the same comments in the same way? Is the presentation different? So I think you do have a basis, and starting out kind of where you were in the past is good to know. Having that institutional knowledge is always helpful on a brand, but you can't necessarily use it as a hard line basis every single time and go back to the same thing. Situations are different, inputs are different, and where that asset is going to be is different. How it looks might be different. So for me, something like a banner ad and how our safety is presented on banner ad, we might have that exact same content on like a banner, like a literal banner at a Congress, right? But your eye level is different, how the size of everything is different. So it just depends on the asset.
How important are metrics in the pre-review process, in the concept review process? Are they appropriate to use, or does that suppress creativity or suppress the ideation process?
I definitely think metrics have an important role to play. I don't think that you could end all be all at metrics, but I do think that they're important for things like, how's the quality coming in? Like, is there a reason we're doing 6 reviews? Is it because it's a complex piece, or is it because there's a lot of changes that continually need to be, addressed or weren't addressed? So I think that your timing and who's looking at things, I think all of that has a really important role to play so that you can see how efficiently you're operating, especially now, companies want to do more with maybe less resources, particularly at a small to mid-sized company. The resources aren't always there And so understanding where you can save time, where you can save money without compromising your overall quality and your overall marketing platform, I think is important.
How disruptive has AI been for you in the concept review process, and what disruptions are you expecting?
It hasn't been super disruptive as yet in the concept review process. I would anticipate that it doesn't have to be disruptive. I think it can be helpful. I think it can be something to think about in the concept review process. I don't anticipate any immediate disruption. I think that it's going to depend on how the marketing wants to use AI, right? It can be in so many different things that I really just think we're not sure yet what's going to come. And so to prep for something we're not sure about, I don't think any of us have the headspace for that.
Just to be clear, all opinions are her own. They do not represent any legal or regulatory advice. They are for educational purposes only.
Yes.
There we go.
Thank you.
Thank you, Heather.